We'll go ahead and get started, but first I have to tell you the irony of all this is that I really didn't set out to study bullying or harassment and any of the other toxic behaviors that we're going to talk about today. My background is industrial organizational psychology, and my Canada Research Share was really supposed to be focusing on how leaders can create psychologically healthy workplaces. The problem is when we would go to try to create those psychologically healthy workplaces, one of the largest barriers was often issues around things like harassment, bullying, behavior that was less than civil in the workplace, and that I will come to refer to, as you will see as we start to go through some of the literature, as toxic behavior in the workplace. So what we need to do is sort of go through some of the literature. I'll get you up to date on some of the more recent meta-analyses that have been done. And I am hoping I will not lose people in jargon, because there is a lot of jargon in this area, but unfortunately what we're often doing is talking about the same thing using different terms. Sometimes there are important differences, but often there's a lot of overlap in the constructs. So what I'm trying to do is use very large-scale meta-analyses from the literature just to give you a feel of overall what many empirical studies are saying in a given area. So whenever you hear meta-analysis, you actually know what it is, you just don't know what it is. It's just basically a summary of the literature. So yes, they're using empirical findings and they're crunching all kinds of numbers to see what the average effect size is, but they're basically just trying to get a feel in one study what a whole bunch of research studies show about a given area that they're looking at. And of course, they're very careful about their definitions. So there will be times that I will use specific terms, such as I will refer to harassment, or I will say that they were maybe looking at abusive supervision. If I'm being that specific, it's because that's the title they use. That's how they defined the term, the construct in the study they were looking at. But in general, I will default to talking about toxic behavior because it often overlaps. I mean, if we had a Venn diagram, it would be a bit of a mess because there's a lot of overlap. And so you just have to bear with me with some of these terms. So anyone who really doesn't want to have an update on the literature, go get yourself a cup of coffee, come back in about 15 minutes, because that's when we'll be getting into some practical solutions and what a manager needs to know about this and what you can actually do about it. So just to jump in and get started, already covered that. So some of the definitions that we do need to get a little bit of clarification around. Today, I'm not focusing on typical incivility or interpersonal conflict or even verbal aggression. So the kind of workplace behaviors, often toxic behaviors, that might occur between peers. This is not about those kind of situations. This is really much more about a harassment situation or a bullying situation, typically from an individual who is in a position of power. I'm also not talking about discrimination in the workplace or about physical aggression in the workplace. So some of the more serious things or very specific categories in terms of discrimination where a person is being judged based on a social category, we're not really going to get into those kind of issues today. We're going to be focusing more on general bullying and harassment, particularly coming from those in positions of power. Although we will talk a little bit in a few minutes about some of the different effects depending on where the abuse is coming from and who the perpetrator is. I just want to make very clear, I'm not saying that these other things are not serious. And in fact, something like interpersonal conflict, the study that I referred to at the bottom of the slide, McCabe et al., that came out of a very large-scale study that we did when I was at the University of Toronto with the engineering department. We had gone across construction sites across Ontario, working with the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board there, and we found very clear links between interpersonal conflict in the workplace and accidents that were happening on the job in these construction sites. So these are very serious, and I'm not suggesting that peer conflict is not very dangerous, but it's just not where we're specifically focusing today. So I just want to make sure that we have that clear from the get-go. So where will we be focusing? Okay, we're going to really be focusing on a general category called harassment, which can be defined as negative workplace interactions that affect the terms, conditions, or employment decisions related to an individual's job or create a hostile, intimidating, or offensive environment. Now, typically within harassment, which tends to be more of a legal term, and we can talk a little bit about that later, although I do not claim to have any expertise in labor law. And so my role as a psychologist is to help us understand the impact on individuals in the workplace. But there are specific terms that very much apply to the law. And I know, having served as an expert witness in these cases, these terms matter very much. But one subcategory of harassment is bullying in particular, which is the repeated and enduring aggressive behaviors intended to be hostile or perceived as hostile. It's sometimes referred to as abusive supervision. And this again brings the power into it, where subordinates' perception of the extent to which a supervisor engages in sustained displays of hostile verbal and nonverbal behaviors, obviously excluding physical contact. But as I said, we're not going to try to get into these terms too much, but there is that power imbalance there. There are some problems with these terms right out of the gate, and we will be looking at a particular context as one example, where I'm going to illustrate the situation in project management teams from a chapter I wrote with one of my graduate students. And you will see that this is not all that clean a term. So bullying is a tricky one when we're talking about sustained context. What do you do with an individual who's bullying in several project management teams, but sequentially, not necessarily within one team? So there are definitely some challenges with these terms even here, but we'll hold off to get into that just for now. So much of what I'll be talking about is really harassment or bullying, but I will tend to refer to it as toxic workplace behavior, just so that we can keep it somewhat broad without hassling over the particular terms. Okay, so if we, and I put a reference in here from table 1 of our bullying chapter, if you're actually looking for a summary of these different terms in terms of being able to cite the differences between them, that just gives you a better feel of that. Also, for those of you who are more familiar with the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health terms, these are definitely stressors, and we will be returning to that theme as well. Also, I know in the more medical type literature, for example, the work Mark White does with this institute, they would be talking about them as modifiable risk factors. So they are definitely modifiable risk factors in the workplace. They are also stressors. So hopefully you're still with me. We're now I'm going to give you some examples of what these behaviors would look like. And obviously I can't quote from confidential interviews or from any of my leadership clients, but what I will do is I will use a very popular text that did an excellent job of discussing some very poignant examples of what this behavior looks like. It was written in 2009 by Kusi and Holloway. The book was actually called Toxic Workplaces, and they had some great quotes in that book that really illustrate what I've seen in my practice and also in my research. And here's how they would describe it. Call them what you will: control freaks, narcissists, manipulators, bullies, poisonous individuals, or humiliators. What these people do is poison, corrupt, pollute, and contaminate. These interactions pervade our thoughts and sap our energies so much that they have the potential to undermine our sense of well-being. In a variety of ways, they get under our skin, infiltrate our professional and personal space, demoralize us, demotivate teams, and ultimately can even make us doubt our own competence and productivity. They are toxic in every sense of the term. And were you in person with me here, I would now typically ask people how many of you have worked with a toxic individual. And in my experience, typically the vast majority of a room, usually let's say 95% of the room, will raise their hand and say, absolutely, I've been there, I've worked with a toxic individual. But then I always go on to ask one more question. Well, how many of you are toxic individuals? Not many hands go up. And so the challenge is, if we've all worked with these toxic individuals, but none of us are these toxic individuals, how is this happening? And we start to see how complicated it gets very quickly, because different people have different perceptions. And we can see toxic behavior in others, but not so much in ourselves. And this is where it gets really tricky when you're dealing with leaders, particularly as you go up the hierarchy in organizations. In larger organizations, for example, how often are those at the most senior levels getting feedback from others in the workplace? They're not typically. And so we start to believe that our jokes are just that funny and we're just that interesting and people are that happy with what we're doing. And we start to take silence as agreement and participation. And it gets very difficult. And so one of the things you're going to see when we're talking about the solutions later is the importance of feedback, because leaders don't necessarily set out to be toxic, but as they move up the ranks, they sometimes forget to be self-aware and to self-monitor, which can become very difficult for those that are trying to work with these individuals who are no longer monitoring the behaviors that they engage in. So we have to recognize that it's just not that straightforward. It's a bit like art, you know. We know it when we see it, but it's often very difficult to define, and that's part of the problem with all of these terms. So specifically today, we're going to be talking about some of the costs of toxic behavior, some of the types of toxic behavior that you can specifically watch for, which is obviously of value, particularly for line managers, because if they see this happening, there's a problem. We're going to talk about some of the myths of toxic behavior at work, and we're also going to talk about 5 steps that organizational leaders can take to keep these behaviors in check. So back to that literature review that I promised, I will try to go through it relatively quickly, because we do need to kind of get a feel of what's come out in the literature over the last decade. And then we will focus in on one particular context, as I mentioned. So what are the antecedents and consequences of workplace harassment? So this study in particular, Bowling and Beer in 2006, introduced an attribution reciprocity-based model, which basically linked harassment to its causes and consequences. And this one really, if you think about it, is relatively straightforward. If people believe that you're out to get them, they tend to strike back. And we know this from the organizational justice literature for sure. So where victims basically reciprocate the reaction directed towards either the individual they believe to be the perpetrator, or sometimes to the organization in the form of, for example, counterproductive workplace behaviors, might be theft, sabotage, etc., if they believe that the organization is actually the cause of the hostile behavior. So this meta-analysis went on to look at the predictors and also the consequences of harassment, particularly workplace harassment. And some of the stressors that they found were most associated were things like role conflict. So this is where you're being told what to do by one boss, one thing, and then told by someone else to do something different. Also role ambiguity, where you really don't know what you're supposed to be doing. Role overload as well, where people just can't keep up with what's expected of them. Work constraints, all associated with workplace harassment. Autonomy, interestingly, or the ability to control what you're doing, was actually negatively associated with harassment. Harassment was also positively associated with generic strains, with anxiety, depression. So now we're getting into some of the mental health consequences of harassment, with burnout, with frustration, with negative emotions at work, physical symptoms, counterproductive workplace behaviors, as I've already mentioned, and also turnover intentions. Harassment was also negatively associated with positive emotions at work, with self-esteem, with life satisfaction, job satisfaction, organizational commitment, and perceptions of organizational justice. So I think we already are getting a sense of the scope of some of these connections in the workplace. This particular meta-analysis that was done in 2007 by Hershkovitz was actually looking at predicting workplace aggression. And in terms of what predicts whether people will actually strike back for these kind of things towards the person, the interpersonal aggression, or the organization, one of the better predictors was trait anger. So now we're looking at some of the personal predictors, and also interpersonal conflict. These were the best predictors of interpersonal aggression. In contrast, the strongest predictor of organizational aggression was actually interpersonal conflict. So this is going to be happening, typically it's going to be happening with the supervisor, although sometimes it can also be happening at the peer level. Situational constraints, some of the role stressors we talked about, and also job dissatisfaction. Perceptions of poor leadership and interpersonal injustice were the strongest predictors of supervisor-targeted aggression. So, Hershkovitz and Barling, this is basically getting at whether or not it matters who the perpetrator is. So does it make a difference in terms of whether it's the coworker, the supervisor, or outsiders within the organization? That could be customers, for example. So this study compared 3 attitudinal outcomes: job satisfaction, effective commitment, and turnover intent. It also looked at behavioral outcomes: interpersonal deviance, organizational deviance, and work performance, and 4 health-related outcomes: general health, depression, emotional exhaustion, and physical well-being. And then it broke them down according to whether it was supervisor, coworker, or outsider that was perceived to be the perpetrator. We won't get into all of the numbers, but I think you can see very quickly that there are connections to just about everything. So job satisfaction, effective commitment, turnover intentions, health, depression, interpersonal deviance, organizational deviance, performance. The relationship between supervisor aggression and interpersonal deviance targeted at the supervisor was quite high. So we start to see that supervisor aggression has stronger adverse relationships than coworker aggression, with things like job satisfaction, commitment, turnover intent, health, organizational deviance, and performance. And again, these numbers are less important. They're there for the people who want the details, and certainly you can go look at the actual article. But I think you get a feel that it's pretty widespread in terms of the consequences in the workplace of some of these things. Okay, so what about just witnessing it? So that gives us a feel of what happens if you're involved in harassment. But what if you just see the harassment? What if you are not actually someone who is being targeted, but you just see the harassment? Turns out that can be pretty bad for your performance and your mental health as well. So this meta-analysis was looking at what happens if you witness harassment in the workplace. The first study was cross-sectional, and the second study was based on longitudinal studies that have been done. Again, meta-analysis is pulling together a whole bunch of different studies that have been done in the workplace, and they often end up with, around 100 studies separately that have been done. They pull together the effects and they say, okay, across all of this research, on average, how strong are these effects typically? And exposure to workplace bullying was positively associated with mental health, with anxiety, with depression. There was also positive associations with post-traumatic stress disorder. This is interesting because we're starting to get into more specific outcomes here, and you'll see some of the later research we're going to talk about in a minute very much is getting into links between harassment and bullying and PTSD. And this starts to become very important because these are things that are compensable in terms of workers' comp. Not everywhere, different across the provinces. And again, I don't want to get too much into the laws, but it starts to matter that it's linked to things that we know are work-related. General strain, somatization, burnout, physical health problems. There's also significant relationships between bullying and job-related outcomes in terms of intent to leave or turnover intentions, job satisfaction, organizational commitment, and absenteeism. The findings in terms of, now we're into the longitudinal findings, the findings also show that baseline exposure to workplace bullying is significantly related to absenteeism and mental health problems that follow up. So this isn't just about correlational studies where they're related at one point in time, but also over time. Okay, so now if we're looking at mental health in particular, we know that workplace bullying can be task-related, so it can be in terms of unreasonable deadlines, meaningless tasks, excessive monitoring of work, or it can be person-related, so gossiping, verbal hostility, persistent criticism, social exclusion, all of these things would count. Consistent with stress theories, workplace bullying is recognized as the main source of distress associated with decreased well-being, lower satisfaction, performance-related commitment, higher levels of sickness and absenteeism. When asked, 33% of patients with mood disorders attributed their mental health problems to their work situation, making problems at work the most common self-reported cause of depression. So again, here, I won't go through all the numbers. I think you've got a feel at this point that there's obviously serious consequences. And again, we start to see that the literature is now tracking PTSD. So now we're at 2015 when Verkuil did this meta-analysis related to mental health. If we now go on and specifically look at PTSD as a consequence of bullying at work, and this was a study done by Nielsen in 2015, they also looked at bullying in schools. And what we start to see is that, I mean, because we pay so much attention in popular press to bullying in schools, but we often don't pay the same amount of attention to bullying in workplaces. And so this particular study really looked very much at comparing and contrasting the situation in schools versus the situation in workplaces. Again, on a meta-analytic level across the literature in various empirical studies that had been done. And what they found was that the prevalence rates in schools is higher, probably about double that it is in the workplace, and we would assume because that has a lot to do with individuals developing coping skills in time as we grow up. Bullying health problems resemble the symptomatology which characterizes post-traumatic stress disorders. So again, they're starting to say, look, we need to consider this in terms of PTSD. And they were specifically talking about avoidance, intrusion, and hyperarousal. It has therefore been proposed that exposure to bullying may lead to PTSD. So this starts to get pretty specific, and also insurance companies and lawyers start to get more interested in it. A consistent body of evidence shows that persons who bully others at school also likely to be bullies as adults. And so we start to see that there's an intergenerational effect of this. So if we don't get to people early on when they're in schools, it's much more likely that they're going to be part of the problem later when they do get to the workplace. And we would hope that part of why the number does drop is that maybe the bullies are also getting some coping skills, because often one of the predictors of bullying as an adult is that someone has been bullied as a child or was a bully as a child. So again, here we start to see that there are clear links. Findings show that an average of 57% of victims of bullying report symptom scores for PTSD above the cutoff thresholds. In comparison, the estimated lifetime prevalence of PTSD among American adults would only be 7.8%, suggests that PTSD symptoms are overrepresented among bullied persons. Okay, so last part in terms of reviewing literature, study done very recently, really getting at notions of diversity and whether or not issues around harassment and bullying and some of these toxic workplaces, whether or not they're impacting everyone equally. So if you're a woman, if you're a racial minority, if you're a person with physical challenges, how are these affecting people differently? So this, again, a meta-analysis done. They were looking specifically at the magnitude of sex and race differences in the perception of workplace mistreatment. They found that employees who are mistreated are more likely to leave the organization. So again, it's much like we saw in the general literature, but they were specifically focusing on individuals who had minority status, let's say based on sex or race. They also found that they were much more likely to leave the organization, and this has some real implications. So what did they find? Women perceived there to be much more sex-based mistreatment. So 68% of women perceived that there was more mistreatment than the average man. Women, and by the way, I'm specifically focusing on mistreatment because of their sex, not sex-based harassment. So let me just be clear about that. Racial minorities perceived more race-based mistreatment, which again is not a surprise. But contrary to expectations, sex differences in abusive supervision and interpersonal conflict indicated that men are actually more likely to report these forms of mistreatment than women. So if there was a perception that women are being disproportionately targeted or disproportionately reporting, I should say, really, that the women are just complaining about it more. It's not happening to them more, they're just complaining more. These findings would not support that. White employees were also more likely to report interpersonal conflict than minorities. So some of these issues that are being raised around sex or diversity in the workplace, it's not likely that the victims are just reporting it more. It's more likely that something else is going on here. Okay, so what are the takeaways from the literature review overall? There are different definitions and understandings of various forms of mistreatment. Some authors clearly distinguish between them, for example, bullying and harassment. Others believe one term encompasses similar behavior, and they will talk on a more general level of workplace mistreatment or toxic behaviors. Different measuring instruments, different scales that are used can make a difference. The negative acts questionnaire is probably the most common measure, but there are other measures used, and it can matter the type of measurement you're using, and I don't think we're going to have time to get into that today, but it can make a difference. Heterogeneous measurement instruments, different populations, different sampling techniques. This is sort of running through all of the caveats, right? So all of these things can make a difference. But in general, there is a consensus that workplace mistreatment has detrimental effects on a variety of health factors and negatively affects both the work performance and also organizational outcomes of individuals. So what I want to do now is I just want to shift gears a little bit to focus on one context that I think is increasingly going to be a center for this type of behavior. And certainly this is what I've seen in my own research and my own consulting work, where we see that because of changes in the workforce, the way work is being structured, the lack of typical organizations that do one job for a very long time, and we're moving to more project-based work, we start to see that there is a difference in some of these things when we're looking at project-based teams. So when you talk about something like bullying as something that's happening over a sustained period of time, well, what if a project team is only together for a short period of time? What does bullying or harassment look like if you have a group that's only together for a short period of time, but then those individuals disperse and now go into other teams within the same organization, potentially dealing with those same toxic people on other teams? Things start to be less clearly delineated. So we're going to talk for a few minutes about just some of the, we're not going to revisit the definitions too much, but some of the situational problems in project context, some of the predictors, the process issues in terms of the phases of the project that can make a difference in terms of bullying, also some of the consequences, and some of the identification, disruption, and prevention strategies in terms of this context. So 5 important trends facing project teams that we're starting to see is making a difference, really around the time pressure, the pressure to perform in very tight timelines with other potentially subject matter experts that you have not worked with before. And we often see that in designing these groups, there's typically not an awareness of the kind of job design issues that we would look at in most organizations. Let's say if human resources was going in and setting up jobs in a particular way so that it was minimizing some of those NIOSH stressors, right? Trying to make sure that we have, that the tasks are set up and delineated well, that there's not role conflict, there's not role ambiguity, that people have autonomy, that they have feedback. A lot of this is not being done when they're setting up these project teams very quickly. So some of the negative behaviors directed towards members in an organization that are recurring, persistent, and continuous are very difficult to look at in this kind of a context, but they're happening nonetheless. Interpersonal aggression or hostility, screaming, threatening, passive, social isolation, spreading rumors, excessive criticism. When you look at the literature on project management teams, what very little work has been done, these are common. It also typically involves an imbalance of power. So again, between the perpetrator and the target, bullies are often leaders or senior organizational members, most commonly found in large male-dominated organizations. 2 notable challenges, as I've already alluded to, is that if bullying is supposed to be recurring, what happens when we've got isolated cases of bullying by a given perpetrator, but they're happening across teams? It's a little tricky to track. There are various phases, and I won't get into the specifics of the phases, but let me just say that one thing that really comes out in the literature is that once the phases start, it is very difficult for an individual target to change the trajectory or to get themselves out of that situation, which is why it is so important that we get in there and intervene on the front end, because trying to intervene once the phases have begun is very difficult. Okay. So in terms of individual level predictors, I think we've looked at most of these previously in the general literature. Again, these are all task-based design issues, the workload, the pace, role ambiguity. All of these things make a difference. Obviously, there's a huge cost. So one of the things that has been done in some of the research is trying to look at some of the costs of these type of things. Very large numbers, and again, very similar mental health outcomes in terms of depression, burnout, job detachment, PTSD, drug abuse, suicide. I don't want to get take too long here just because I want to get on to some of the solutions for this. But if we just look at the numbers in terms of how many people say they've worked with someone toxic, we're looking at 94%. So this is obviously going to differ in different workplaces, but we do want to realize that this is very widespread. And this is another quote from Kusi and Holloway. The amount of impact of toxic people is a cost that ripples through the organization. If one could ever show the wide-reaching effects of just one toxic person, I think it would help people to address this sooner. So again, getting in there before the phases have already started to take place, because once you're on that particular trajectory, it's very hard to get off. Okay, so what's a manager supposed to do? Well, number one thing, for better or worse, is that these situations start to look very similar across organizations, across contexts, even whether or not we're in a particularly volatile situation like a project management team. We start to see that there are certain types of behavior that tend to be quite common in terms of toxic behavior. So I'm just going to run through a few of these very common behaviors that as a manager you want to be very attuned to. Particularly, obviously, that's line managers I'm referring to, but obviously in human resources as well, when you're investigating one of these cases, these are some of the typical markers in terms of toxic workplace behavior. So we see shaming behavior, humiliation, sarcasm, potshots, highlighting mistakes. So that might be where someone goes into a meeting and the person chairing the meeting deliberately points out the mistakes of a given individual. They'll ask them a question or put them in a position where they know they don't have the answer just to make them look incompetent in front of everyone else. When displeased with your behavior or performance, the person acts like a parent, hopefully not a very good parent, and shames and blames along with severe emotional swings and temper tantrums. There tends to be a lot of mood issues when it comes to this kind of behavior. People lose their temper and then they resort to some very negative behavior. Demeaning and derogatory, the person will purposely embarrass other people. Okay, number two, hostility. And this can also be passive aggressive, so I don't want to suggest that it's only overt aggression, it's also passive aggression, but they're basically quite paranoid. They tend to distrust everyone. There's verbal attacks if you try to give them any negative feedback whatsoever, clueless about their own toxicity, micromanaging, guarding territory. I mean, it starts to, again, it's the whole, thing about we know art when we see it. Well, I mean, usually we can pretty much see it, but hostility in particular, this active striking back is really, it does tend to be a marker of some of this toxic behavior. Number three, team sabotage. Teams are supported in their work only to showcase a toxic person whose ego is often insatiable. A couple of great quotes from Kusi and Holloway. This person did significant damage to individuals in our team. There was such a degradation of performance in the function he has in the business. No amount of accommodation to his whims changed the situation. It remained everyone else was the problem, and he continued his reign of terror. One of the frustrating things is that as a peer of this individual, I'm not asked for 360 feedback as part of the normal course. So any conversation I have with supervisor is perceived as going out of the way to badmouth the individual. And as you're going to see when we start talking about remedies, this is one of the ways that we can absolutely target this, is by making sure that 360 feedback is built in. So why are these individuals around? There's often assumptions that if these people were so bad, they certainly wouldn't still be in the workplace. Someone would have got rid of them. And I want to take on some of these myths head on very quickly. So some common myths about toxic behavior. Myth number one is, if I would know if there was someone toxic on my team. Senior managers say this a lot. I would know if there was someone toxic on my team. So if people are complaining about it, they're just making it up. No, you wouldn't. These people don't survive by being stupid. They don't typically kick up. Again, some great quotes here that I will let you read later if you want to go through the slides more carefully, but it basically gets at the fact that people can be very charismatic and funny with those above them while still being very abusive to those below them. Myth number two, I can get rid of this person. I cannot get rid of this person. He or she is a good producer. And so in terms of that myth, yes, actually you can. There's been large-scale studies in the literature showing that often once you deal with this toxic behavior, that the performance of the entire team increases. Another quote from Kusi and Holloway, toxic individuals have a tendency to promote mediocrity in their teams, even though a toxic person may be more productive than the others, because they're basically suppressing the behavior of everyone else or the productivity of everyone else. Myth number 3, if their behavior was so bad, people wouldn't put up with it. You know where this is going. Yes, they will put up with it for 100 different reasons. They absolutely will put up with this bad behavior. So working with a toxic individual was one of the worst experiences of my life. It took a long time to recover from her abuse. It was difficult because others witnessed what was happening, but were scared. They might receive the same abuse, so they did not want to get involved. And this absolutely includes peers, and we could do a whole other session just on bystanders and the effects of some of this. People will not intervene because they're very afraid that it's just going to be coming in their direction if they do anything. And you can actually go into organizations and teach them, train them in how to actually do something. And to have the power to do that. Again, this comes down to people feeling that they can step in and know what to do when they're dealing or when they're confronted with a toxic person. And these are just some more quotes from Kusi and Holloway. But this particular quote from page 153, I think is really interesting. An entire system of more than 70 people can devote more than a decade of their lives trying to survive workplace assaults to their dignity. And if this individual has power or this individual has protectors above, especially if they're in a hierarchical organization, in a system where it's unionized potentially, this individual can have a reign of terror for a very long time while people struggle to figure out how on earth to deal with this. Where do leaders come in? Effective organizations have to know what's the best for the good of the whole team and could put the interests of one individual above that. They cannot put the interests of one individual above that, or else the organization is going to break down over the long term. So we start to see that there is very strong evidence that certain outcomes occur when key stakeholders are involved in a change process. There's going to be a lot more commitment, ownership, and results. So leaders have to get involved if they're going to turn this ship around. Myth number 4, this person can be dealt with individually. I'm speeding up a little bit here because I want to make sure I leave time for questions, and I've gone on a little bit long. This person can be dealt with individually. No, they can't be dealt with individually. You absolutely have to have a system to deal with this. The longer the toxic behaviors are tolerated and accommodated, the more widespread the impact. We have concluded that one brave person without a system of support cannot solve the problem of toxicity. First, implement systems approaches and then work with individual approaches. Involve as many stakeholders as possible, and I've given you some specific examples of some questions you can ask when you're actually interviewing and trying to get out ahead of engaging with someone who does tend to be toxic. But also, if you look at the chapter that I referred to earlier in project management teams, we also talk about 5 specific solutions to consider as a manager in terms of what you can do. And in some ways, I suppose, from an industrial organizational perspective, they're somewhat less than surprising because we're right back to the old NIOSH stressors and how we avoid these stressors in the workplace. We have to carefully select and support teams. You can't just assume people are going to get along because they're subject matter experts. They will not. You have to have compatible personalities. You have to have coaching. You have to have support for the team to make sure that the team can get along. You also have to proactively design the job. You have to make sure that you've taken care of things like role ambiguity, role conflict, task significance, all of these things that Hackman and Oldham talked about years ago in terms of the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health stressors in the workplace. You have to monitor workloads in particular. Overloaded people tend to strike out. You have to clearly outline responsibilities. You also have to limit the terms often of those in power. And this is, I think, becoming more popular in public sector organizations because people are realizing that power corrupts. And we've known this for a long time, but we sort of, don't want to deal with it. But as we see movements across the world, not just in organizations, but politically, you realize that without term limits, power can corrupt in a very deep way. Proactively monitor for bullying behavior. It's not enough to just do exit interviews with people. They're important. That will point out some of your worst bullies, but you really have to be doing things like the negative acts questionnaire and finding out what's happening before people get to that point. Manage performance. You have to set rules of engagement, decide what civil behavior looks like in your context, and then hold people accountable to those rules. You have to manage that performance, and if people aren't living up to it, you have to deal with it because they're likely impacting the performance of everyone around them. consistent and fair evaluations. I've been in organizations that are pretty large and they don't do evaluations on a regular basis. They have to be done, and the feedback has to go back. You have to carefully choose managers who know how to get the best out of their teams. And you absolutely have to adopt a system-based approach. Removing a bully from an environment is not going to remedy the situation if everyone around him or her has also become toxic because of the situation that's been created over, let's say, a decade. You have to have feedback and you have to get in there to change the culture, which is often very difficult once it's begun. I'll just leave you with a quote from CEO in Kusi and Holloway, where he's talking about the fact that organizations need to pay very close attention to what gets accomplished, but also how it gets accomplished. Values matter, we know this, but how we live out those values is only through holding people accountable in terms of their behaviors. And last but not least, I would say that respectful engagement is perhaps not natural for any of us. It's called self-monitoring. We teach kindergarten students how to play nice in the sandbox, but it is definitely teachable. And so I think we often throw up our arms and say, well, what are you going to do? Different personalities. Yeah, no. We can behave well when we're managing up, and we can behave well when we're managing at the peer level or when we're managing our direct reports and teams. So this is really often about self-awareness and self-monitoring, and it can be taught. All right, now back to you, Angie, if there are any questions.
Thank you. To our audience, if you have any questions at this time, please enter them to the question box on the GoToWebinar panel and we'll read them out loud. One comment that came in that I would just like to comment on is from our audience, yes, I have worked with a toxic individual. I have been that person in the past, and it was awful because I was negative. I was not in a position that was suited to me, and there was so much opportunity for growth in both situations. So that's from our audience, just a comment.
And that's quite typical, where we can see once, as we reflect on it and as we get a little further in an organization, if we are being tuned into this and trying to be self-aware, we start to realize, oh, wait a minute, sometimes I can be part of the problem, and how do I change that, right? So it can be on both sides, where we've experienced it, we know how awful it is, and then hopefully we learn from that and try not to become a perpetrator in terms of others in our workplace when we're stressed.
Yeah, absolutely. One question, can you clarify the term hostile as it pertains to the workplace?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Again, it's often in the eyes of the beholder, because if you're on a construction site, much of my work has been in emergency medical services, heavy industry, construction sites, shipbuilding. It's going to be different. What is hostile will be context specific. What is considered hostile in an emergency room versus in the field, it's going to be different. It's very difficult to come up with a definition that doesn't pay attention to context. The other tricky part, again, with any interpersonal interaction, is that sometimes the things we say to our friends, if you were to take them in text, and by the way, this is part of the problem with all of the texting that's going on right now, and I won't get into the term, but mobbing is starting to become an issue in terms of where people will group together online and go after one individual. The way things sound in text is often very different than the way they sound in person, and so this is complicated. So I'm not trying to dodge the question, but to tell you what is hostile, it really depends on the particular context that we're dealing with. And that doesn't justify it, but it does mean that you're going to have to define it individually at the time in terms of the norms for that group.
Another question, after a toxic incident, how does discipline assist in resolution?
I think it depends. I think if the discipline is just punitive, probably not much. If the discipline involves finding a way to incorporate feedback in the future and an action plan for how you're going to take that feedback, integrate it into the person's new behavior and work with it, then it can make a difference. So I think it depends on how the discipline is done. I think just, slapping someone on the wrist after the fact is not going to solve a problem. However, if we get that person lined up for example, with a coach, or we get them actually working with someone. Well, I mean, industrial organizational psychologists do this all the time, and human resources, I mean, often doesn't have the resources to do this, but if you can get this individual starting to be able to become more self-aware and to self-monitor and to understand their impact on others, you can then sometimes turn the behavior around. But I think punitively, I mean, I suppose you can simply threaten in terms of, you know, where you're going to lose your job, but often that just sends the behavior underground. And so unless you're modifying the behavior on the front end and changing some of the stressors that are typically leading this person to strike out, it's likely to be a very short-term effect. You really have to take a big picture and look at what are the systemic causes of why this is happening. And also, how are we part of the problem? I mean, how we reward behavior matters. And leaders send clear signals about what will be rewarded. And if you get rewarded for delivering a project on time, that can bring out some pretty nasty behaviors near the end of the project. So,
mm-hmm. And leading another question, how do policies assist? Do they include methods on how to handle the toxic situations?
absolutely. And there are some recommendations. So if we were to actually look at, I didn't include the slide today because I didn't want to get into too much detail about it, but the standards for psychological health and safety at work, the Canadian standards that are still voluntary, actually go into all of that in terms of how you can start to impact the culture and how you can begin to make some changes, but you definitely have to have the policies and procedures in place. And so there are actually policies and procedures that are referred to in that standard for the investigation of specific incidents, which would include a provision to individuals to actually file a complaint. So telling people that they can file a complaint, they would be asked to conduct an investigation by a neutral third party as soon as possible after the incident. There'd be consultation with each party involved. There would be evidence gathering. There would be communicating the decision to the parties involved, documenting the process and maintaining records. So if you actually just go online and Google that standard, you'll find that there's very clear guidelines for how you can put some of those policies in place. So that's the standard for psychological health and safety at work, and it's basically a Canadian standard that is still voluntary at this point, although I could definitely see it becoming mandatory in the future.
Mm-hmm. And we can absolutely include that to our follow-up items to our audience too.
Okay.
Can you expand upon the negative questionnaire? What kind of questions are asked?
So one of the things that we see in the literature is that it makes a difference whether or not you self-identify as having been exposed to harassment, or whether we look at your behavioral experiences. So if I just say to you, have you ever been bullied in the workplace? You may well say no. But then if I ask you, well, have you experienced these following things: being yelled at by a supervisor, had your name removed from an email for an invitation to a meeting, and we have the whole list of negative behaviors that can occur, we start to see that changes the reporting of these incidents. So sometimes people will believe that they've been bullied when actually maybe it doesn't meet the criteria. Others will not recognize the behaviors until they actually see them. So we do tend to see that you have to look at the different behaviors specifically in order to know whether or not you're talking about the same thing.
Okay. Can you suggest some resources for employees that are struggling with the emotional fallout of being bullied?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I have to be honest. I would say there's not a lot out there in terms of this. I know some individuals that I have worked with found books like the Cousy and Holloway book around toxic workplace behaviors very useful. Partially, I think, because they realized they were not alone, and they realized just how serious the effects of some of this can be. There's also Bob Sutton out of Stanford University has written some really interesting books with interesting titles around what he calls, quote, assholes in the workplace. And that is actually the title of the book. And he has some pretty specific books about how to deal with these individuals in the workplace. And I mean, part of it is just figuring out that you're not alone, but part of it is giving you some decent strategies. I'll just share really quickly. One of the ones that I find very useful when working with some clients is what we call gray rock, which is that sometimes people feel they have to engage. They feel that they have to fight back. If the person is in a position of power over you, unless you're going to leave your job, which is probably what I would recommend, is to have a get out of jail plan. But short of leaving your job, you don't always have to respond, and you don't have to respond in real time. A lot of time there is such a shame that is involved in not fighting back, in sucking it up and walking away, and just accepting that you can, quote, gray rock them, that you can just kind of give them nothing, that you can pull back from that until you have a plan and then get out of there, is sometimes the best solution. So I would encourage the person to reach out and try to actually work with a professional that could help them in terms of their individual situation. But there are definitely some good books in the literature. I would start with maybe one of Bob Sutton's books for sure, or Kusi and Holloway book on toxic workplaces, just to kind of get a feel of the fact that you're not alone and that this can be very serious, and some of the ways that you can cope with it individually. And often individual coping, it's going to look quite mundane at first. It's often around things like meditation and relaxation and getting control of your inner dialogue and recognizing that this is not you. You are not alone. You're not necessarily the problem. You might be part of the problem, and you can talk about that. And that's where getting in touch with an individual professional is so important. If you have a workplace benefit plan and you can engage in counseling, it's probably the best way to go, because you can find out how you are contributing to the situation. But a lot of times it's about calming yourself and finding ways to protect yourself and keep yourself psychologically and physically healthy while you navigate through this and hopefully out of it.
Mm-hmm. And we can include also the author's books in our follow-up materials to the audience too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Do you have any suggestions, or do you know of an action plan to change toxic behavior in the workplace?
I would say that the systematic approach that we recommend in the chapter that I cited, which again we could also perhaps link to the webpage, that really is the best we've got right now, which is a systematic approach around saying what our rules of engagement are, what it is like to have civil behavior in the workplace, and also what are the consequences of not engaging in that civil behavior, and making feedback an integral part of the process. I cannot overstate the importance of regular 360 feedback for all supervisors and all leaders, so that we know what's actually going on. A lot of times they're completely unaware. And so it's very important that they get that feedback and that they know the behaviors that are making people crazy around them. So you absolutely have to have that feedback. There's also been some other respectful workplace programs, civility, respect, and engagement programs that are starting to creep into the workplace, and they're beginning to make a difference. Some early research is showing that you can actually go in and do these kind of interventions, but it's often around setting a bar, holding people accountable to the bar, and having regular feedback, constant after-action reviews where you review with managers how they're going about things, the consequences of that, and how they can do it better.
Mm-hmm. Another question that came through, any suggestions for remote-based workers where monitoring is not always easy to do as communication occurs outside of a leader's view?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Now, I'm guessing that communication is probably happening via email, which can be really tricky. We recently wrote a paper on cyber aggression in the workplace, and that can be very difficult. People can be quite awful to each other in emails. I suppose the upside is if you are supervising those individuals, you probably in time, if necessary, the Human Resource Department would have access to the kind of emails being sent. So there is more of a paper trail. But in terms of the impact on individuals in the organization, the impacts can be equally devastating if you get a really caustic email as they are to have someone yell at you in person. So I would say that, again, there has to be rules of engagement around email, around electronic communication. That's a huge issue for remote workers, where that's all they've got is communication that's happening electronically and remotely. So you better have very clear parameters about what is and is not acceptable in email, and encouraging people. I can't say this strongly enough, to sometimes pick up the phone, because yes, they may not be able to be in person, but even being able to have that simultaneous communication over the phone is huge, because the problem with sequential communication is we misunderstand. And with simultaneous communication, even if it's only over the phone, we can correct each other. We can get some form of shared understanding and hopefully move forward. But you really have to reach out and be very diligent at making a conscious effort to do that, because otherwise problems can just fester for a very long time and have very similar emotional impacts to situations where they were in person.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one more question, but for those of you that did ask questions and we didn't get to, we will take them outside and possibly do a follow-up in our response to you for those questions. But Catherine, could you elaborate on what the 3 phases are in the progression of bullying that you mentioned earlier?
Sure. I don't know how close are we for time? Do I have time to?
Yeah, we can finish the question and then we'll do the some follow-up questions, or in the follow-up
Okay.
email. Mm-hmm.
There's been 2 different models that are proposed. One is a 3-phase model where, let's say, some of the bullying might start with rumors or isolation, but then you start to see an intensification of the bullying. And so what will happen is, so they'll basically, maybe what I'll do is I'll describe the more extensive model, because the 3rd model is somewhat nested within the 4-phase model. There's a critical event that basically triggers the situation. There's then bullying and stigmatization of the individual, and then the target complains to management, and then often, if management does nothing, the target ends up leaving the organization. So what you see is there's a progression where there's an incident that triggers it, there's an intensification, and then even when the person tries to do something, nothing happens. And so often the way it ends up, unfortunately, is that the individual has no choice to leave, because, again, very hard to turn that ship around once it gets going in a particular direction. And so the point was that for some time we sort of had this attitude that victims could just fight back. Why don't they just do something? Why don't they change the situation? Well, when you start looking at very large numbers of victims and no one's able to change the situation, then it's time to start looking at the context. Something else is going on there. There's a process that has begun, and once it's begun, it's very hard to turn it around. And it doesn't take, a lot of effort to visualize that in a school. Like when we think back to the schoolyard, what would it have taken for someone who was in a victim situation to turn that situation around and deal with the bully? Typically what it takes is bystanders and leaders to change the situation. So when bystanders intervene, when leaders intervene, now you might have a chance. But if those individuals are not on board, then typically the person has little choice but to leave the organization.
Mm-hmm. I think that's all our time for questions at the moment. Dr. Loughlin, is there anything you'd like to add following your presentation?
No, I think that's all. I think the challenge is that, especially the optimists among us, we don't want to deal with a lot of these issues. They're difficult and they're challenging, and this notion that we can be victims and perpetrators makes it particularly difficult, because most of us don't want to believe that we could ever be toxic. But given enough stress in the workplace, given the right conditions, most of us do things that we wouldn't think we would normally do. And so I think that we can't overstate the importance of self-awareness, self-monitoring, and feedback. And that means that systems have to be set up to put those things in place. And that's where leaders come in if we want to create psychologically healthy workplaces, which was the whole point of the work I was doing.
Yeah, so, this is a very popular topic. Thank you so much for taking the time to present on it.
My pleasure. It's important.
Yeah.